The new Chicago Bears coaching staff will shape how Ryan Poles approaches free agency. And don't be surprised if the Bears sign more than a few players that these coaches have already worked with on previous teams.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On the show today, we identify some potential Chicago Bears free agent targets that this new Bears coaching staff already knows. Ben Johnson's assembled a group here with a bunch of different backgrounds and have worked on different teams. And some of those players, those coaches have worked with before, are entering free agency. And so Bears could fill some needs on their roster with some players that their coaches are already a little bit more familiar with. And then it's a little bit less risk of an investment when it's not some outside player you're hoping will fit nicely, but you just don't know for sure until you actually get them in the building. So we'll look at some guys on the offensive line, some potential starters there, some potential upgrades for the defensive line, as well as some intriguing skill position players, running backs, wide receivers, a tight end I want to throw in there, maybe a couple veteran quarterback options as well, and maybe the biggest carrot at the end of the stick of them all, a couple of fullbacks hitting free agency could bring the fullback back to the Chicago Bears. But a lot of names to keep an eye on here that I think the connection here would rise above just any other plain old free agent who might be good or even a better player, but this is the one that these coaches might be more familiar with. Obviously, there's different levels of familiarity with different coaches, right? Like, just because a coach was on the team at the same time that a player was on the team doesn't necessarily mean that they interacted a ton or that that coach is going to have some otherworldly insight into why they should or shouldn't sign that player. But when you've got a couple of different people on the Bears coaching staff with offensive coordinating experience on other teams, they would be more intimately involved with a lot of other players along the offensive line and can tell you on the front end, like, hey, this is what this guy's like in the locker room. This is what he might fit in our organization. Even if that player hasn't done Ben Johnson's offense specifically before, it at least gives you a leg up on some of the other free agents that you just don't know as well because you haven't had a coach work with them directly. So, I mean, like, this does start even with the biggest name in the free agent offensive line pool, Trey Smith of the Kansas City Chiefs. You'd think at first, like, okay, well, where's the real connection there? But Chicago Bears running backs coach Eric Bieniemy was the Kansas City Chiefs offensive coordinator through 2022. And so while he hasn't been around Trey Smith the last 2 seasons, he was there for Trey Smith's first 2 seasons. His offensive coordinator is in Chicago. He knows how Trey Smith was as a pro his first 2 years. There's a connection there, an understanding of the kind of work Trey Smith was putting in off the field. And of course, things can change in 2 years. It's not as though the Bears have all of the perfect intel on Trey Smith, but it's not like this is some other outside free agent coming from some team that you can ask people and you can call around, but if you haven't actually worked with him, then you don't know exactly what you're getting there. So like Trey Smith right away jumps out as, yeah, there's a connection there. And the Bears will have more information than some other teams that may also be interested in giving Trey Smith a big contract this offseason. Some other names. The obvious one maybe is Kevin Zeitler of the Detroit Lions, one of the few Lions offensive free agents this offseason that could be available to come over with Ben Johnson. It might be nice to have someone who has run this offense and has worked in this system before that you can plug into the offensive line. He'll lock down one of your starting guard spots as a veteran, not cost too much, but also he's not going to be a long-term solution here because he turns 35 next month. How many more seasons of high-level football do you have from Kevin Zeitler? We will see. But as a short-term option there, obviously the Ben Johnson and the rest of the Lions coaching staff connection, it makes Zeitler a strong candidate there. We'll throw in a former Jacksonville Jaguar then, Brandon Scherf, because the Bears hired Press Taylor to be the passing game coordinator in Chicago. So even though he's not going to be coaching the offensive line here specifically, and he wasn't coaching the offensive line specifically in Jacksonville, he was the offensive coordinator for 3 seasons there with Brandon Scherf. So he knows very well how, even as recently as this past season, how much Scherf still has left in the tank, how well he's taking care of his body at this stage of the process. Like, I think it's important to note that just because the Bears have these connections to these players doesn't necessarily make it more likely that they'll sign them, but it does make it like that they'll have better information about whether to sign them or not, because maybe the familiarity is a way of saying, yeah, I worked with him and now I don't want to anymore, or like I worked with him and I want to leave it there. We don't need to bring him here because I've been there and done that in that way. Like that's the advantage, right? It's not that, oh, you're more likely to be able to sign him. It's that you can make a more informed decision about whether you want to sign him or not. Like if Ryan Poles wants to make a left tackle change and bring in a veteran to compete with, or just to bump down Braxton Jones at left tackle, someone like Cam Robinson is available. Now, he finished last season with the Minnesota Vikings, but was, of course, a first-round pick of those same Jacksonville Jaguars with Press Taylor. So Press Taylor has a couple of starting caliber offensive linemen in free agency this offseason that he knows well and can inform the Bears on whether or not that's the type of move they may also want to make. A little bit lower on the O-line depth chart, a couple other names that I think we should keep an eye on here. Not headline moves, but guys who have some value here. Andrews Pete of the Las Vegas Raiders was a first-round pick by the New Orleans Saints, and Saints offensive line coach Dan Rochar coached him to, I believe, multiple Pro Bowls, at least one Pro Bowl during his time, 3 Pro Bowls during his time with the New Orleans Saints. He played mostly left guard, but played some left tackle. He's had some injury issues over the course of his career. Now he's, 31? He'll turn 32 about midway through next season. So he's not going to come in and necessarily be your plan A starter, but a veteran who the offensive line coach knows, who can play some guard and some tackle, could be a valuable option there with some starter upside off of the bench. Same with Dan Skipper from the Detroit Lions, right? Another one of these Ben Johnson offensive line free agents that the familiarity there makes it a really tempting signing, just to have a leader in there who knows the coaches, knows the system, et cetera, can really go a long way as you're kind of retooling the Bears O-line as a whole, right? You need a new left guard, center, and right guard. And so if you bring in 3 brand new players from outside of the outside of the organization or outside of the coaching staff's familiarity, then more than half of your starting offensive line is brand new to everything here and brand new to these coaches and everything. So maybe having some guys in there with some familiarity, whether that's someone like Kevin Zeitler or farther down like Dan Skipper, there can be a nice like coaching to player continuity bridge there by getting guys with some familiarity to your offensive coaching staff. Now, the Bears may very well just go out and sign 3 guys that didn't have any connection to the coaching staff, and they're going to sign free agents that don't have those connections. But I just think generally, especially when it's a brand new staff, kind of getting some of their guys in here can go a long way. And that same thing may be true for the defensive line, where we'd like to see the Bears add another defensive end opposite Montez Sweat to upgrade the pass rush, add some more depth at defensive tackle in there. And there are a lot of free agent defensive linemen with connections to this new Chicago Bears defensive coaching staff. A lot of defensive ends, a lot of New Orleans Saints and Dallas Cowboys to go through here, but we'll go through some of the upcoming names that the Bears can really go out and get some familiar faces for their coaches to bolster that D-line next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, because you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. So whether you want to bet on LeBron James's points or the Bulls to figure some things out, whatever it might be, you could get in on the action with FanDuel or any of your other favorite sports. Just because football season's over doesn't mean the fun stops at FanDuel. They've got NHL hockey, they've got tennis and soccer and boxing, and when baseball season comes around, FanDuel's a great way to get in on the action there as well. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. This Bears defensive coaching staff has a lot of connections to a lot of upcoming free agents on the defensive line. And I didn't go through the linebacker position or the cornerback spot, but I'm guessing they have a lot of connections to a lot of free agents, not just the defensive line, but that's where the Bears have the bigger need. There's a couple safeties out there as well. I did take a glance at it, but if you're talking about not even all necessarily top end starting caliber players, but you can go down the list. And I think I found on a quick glance almost 15 different free agent defensive linemen, some starters, some backups, that this Bears defensive coaching staff has some real direct connections to. Now, if you think about it, you got Dennis Allen as defensive coordinator coming over from the Saints. So anybody who's been on the Saints is a spot for some real connection. You've got your defensive line coach is a guy by the name of Jeremy Garrett, who spent last season as the Jaguars defensive line coach. There's a couple of names he has a connection to that are hitting free agency. But then your linebackers coach, Richard Smith, has been with the Colts the last couple of seasons. There's a couple of guys he's worked with. And then your defensive backs coach, Al Harris, comes from the Dallas Cowboys. And it feels like half of that Dallas Cowboys defensive line is hitting free agency right now. And so while, say, for example, Al Harris did not coach defensive line in Dallas, he was in all the defensive meeting rooms and watching all the defensive tape and practice and everything around all of the defensive linemen there, so that he can tell you how these guys carry themselves, how they participate in practice, the kind of effort they give, the kind of work they put in the offseason, et cetera. He's got relationships with these players, even if he wasn't their exact direct position coach. And so, we could spend 25 minutes going through all the different defensive linemen, but a couple I want to highlight here as far as free agent defensive linemen with some strong ties to the Bears that we should keep an eye on this offseason. I think at the top of the list from a veteran standpoint is DeMarcus Lawrence from the Dallas Cowboys. We've seen how good DeMarcus Lawrence can be when he's healthy, and that's been a caveat as of late. Only played in 4 games this season, but had 3 sacks in those 4 games. He's a 4-time Pro Bowler, made the Pro Bowler in 2023 and 2022. 6'3", 265. He's got the length of a defensive end that someone like Dennis Allen might like. And maybe Al Harris would have a little bit more information on the injury and the medicals from Dallas as far as how that was playing out and whether or not that's something the Bears need to steer clear from or are definitely safe to move forward with. It's just nice to have that information in the positive or the negative there for a potential fairly expensive free agent, even if it's more of a shorter term deal there. He's going to be 33 this season, so he's not the long-term option. But say you sign someone like DeMarcus Lawrence and then draft a pass rusher in the 2nd or 3rd round to rotate in, and you've got yourself a nice long-term plan there. Otherwise, if you want to go with guys who are a little younger or have a little bit more of a future, it could be a longer-term type of deal. One of the names we're going to hear a lot of this offseason is Chase Young. Spent this past season with the New Orleans Saints and Dennis Allen for at least half of that. Dennis Allen helped bring him into the Saints. Before that, of course, teammates with Montez Sweat in Washington. So a lot of familiarity around Chase Young. I have heard stories about some of the things that went wrong for Chase Young in Washington that have always made me hesitant to give him a long-term contract. If you can do it 1 or 2 years at a time, like what he did in New Orleans this year, I'm much more comfortable with that type of a deal for him, but not like a 5-year lock him down kind of thing. And he only had 5.5 sacks this past season and wasn't really the starter in New Orleans, so I'm not expecting it to be some kind of big, massive contract here. But he's 25, turns 26 in April, and there's still plenty of a bright future in front of him as long as he continues to invest in himself and the game of football and really be dedicated to being the best version of the football player that he can be and not have priorities elsewhere. Maybe that's the best way of putting it with someone like Chase Young. But it doesn't have to just be, Chase Young. If you want another New Orleans Saints defensive end with some upside, but a little bit more of a buy low candidate is Marcus Davenport. Spent this past season with the Detroit Lions and Ben Johnson on Ben Johnson's defense, but he was drafted in the 1st round by the Saints in 2018, I think, out of UTSA. Has had a lot of injury issues and has never really quite fully reached that potential. And so, you're not handing Marcus Davenport some huge mega contract by all means. Absolutely not. But bring him into the rotation, some familiarity with this coaching staff, and has pass rushing upside for sure. He had 9 sacks in 11 games in 2021. Like, the problem is it's only 11 games, but he has that length and pass rushing upside and that familiarity with his coaching staff that you really, really might like. A couple other Dallas Cowboys to keep an eye on here. Maybe a name that doesn't jump out right away as like a household name for them because they have Micah Parsons and DeMarcus Lawrence. Then Chauncey Golston, it's kind of their number 3 defensive end. There was a 3rd-round pick for them back in 2021, but he's developed kind of quietly into a nice little player for them. At 5.5 sacks this season, taking over for a starter when DeMarcus Lawrence went down. And if you want to go like younger guy who's still kind of ascending there, is he going to become a 10-sack guy right away? I mean, probably not, but someone who I think is still coming into their own as a defensive end. Again, coaching staff familiarity with someone on your staff in Al Harris, that goes a long way for someone like Golston. But like that Cowboys defensive line, like on the interior, you've got nose tackle Linval Joseph is a free agent. Their starter Osa Odigizua is a name. If the price is right, I would be very interested in. I mean, it's tough because you've got Gervon Dexter and Andrew Billings as your starters, and Osa Odigizua is a 4-year starter for the Dallas Cowboys. 4.5 sacks this past season. Not like a game-changing player who's going to take over, but a really solid interior disruptor. He's going to want to go somewhere and be a starter and get paid like a starter, and that's probably more than what the Bears are going to want to pay him. But if the Bears can kind of justify like, hey, we're going to rotate all these guys in and we just need a better pass rush, maybe it's worth it to keep everybody's legs fresh and have, you can move some guys around a little bit. And we've seen Gervon Dexter even play some defensive end before. We know that Dennis Allen likes bigger defensive ends. I'm not saying a full-time move, but on certain downs and distance situations, you could move some guys around and get creative with how you might want to use them. A little bit on the cheaper side there, Levi Onwuzurike from the Detroit Lions. Kind of a rotational guy for them, but had to play more of a starting role this past season because of injuries on their defensive line. He's only 27. Again, the high production has not been there. These are not guys that are going to come in and totally revolutionize your defensive line and unlock this brand new pass rush, but a higher quality depth at defensive tackle than what the Bears had this past season when Andrew Billings got hurt and Gervon Dexter was in on the lineup and Pickens was underwhelming. Like a guy like Onwuzurike from the Lions is someone who could fill that role and be pretty inexpensive, but more consistent than what the Bears have had in the past. And again, Ben Johnson and the rest of the staff, like they've worked with him. They know what he's like, and you can have more confidence in your evaluation of him and how he might fit your team as a free agent. Like that's how you try and mitigate some of the risk of free agency. It doesn't mean any of these guys might not still be free agent busts, and just because they were a certain way on their previous team doesn't mean they're going to come to Chicago and be that exact same way with a different scheme or different coaches and a different environment, different experience, different teammates. But it's, anything you can do to try and make free agency less risky is a big bonus. And I think the Bears are going to lean on that quite a bit. Obviously, the trenches are where we want to see most of the investment. And from a resources standpoint, we talked about this on Friday's podcast, trying to rank the Bears' offseason needs, and O-line and D-line are kind of the big ones. Offseason is all about the trenches, and those are the spots that the most money and draft pick compensation or should be spent on this Bears roster. But that doesn't mean they're not going to sign free agents at some other spots. And even though the Bears have some weapons for Caleb Williams already to like, they're going to need a number 3 wide receiver. They're going to likely need a number 2 tight end, maybe some more talent at running back to rotate in there. So we'll go through some intriguing names there, and we'll throw in maybe a couple of veteran quarterbacks and some other fun players that could be free agent targets with connections that aren't going to break the bank. These aren't like going to win you your fantasy football league kind of players, but guys who just might be good fits with some experience with these Bears coaches. Next on Locked On Bears. The Bears can't get too greedy here, right, and start spending a bunch of money on another receiver, a bunch of money on another tight end, or a bunch of money on another running back, unless you really have the trenches well addressed via free agency and the draft. And that's just going to take more time than what the Bears can do in one offseason. But there are still some fun names that you recognize, even if it's not 1,000-yard rushers, 1,000-yard receiver type players. It's just like, oh, like that would be a fun player to see on this Bears offense, who also happens to have some connections to the staff in Chicago. Not a lot when it comes to like actual Detroit Lions, like Lions players who played for Ben Johnson who are hitting free agency, I think I mentioned, are a little bit few and far between. It's Kevin Zeitler on the offensive line, Dan Skipper on the offensive line, Allen Robinson, the Bears legend, is a free agent from them. I don't think a reunion's going to happen there, but how about like Tim Patrick, the number 3 receiver in Detroit this season? He had been with the Denver Broncos in his career prior to that, I believe, crossed over with Bears offensive coordinator Declan Doyle for a year there as well. Some real strong Tim Patrick connections that I think make him potentially more likely than a lot of others to follow Ben Johnson to Detroit. But of course, you're competing with Aaron Glenn in New York, and also the Lions want to keep some of these guys. So it's not as simple as just like, yep, sign him up for the Chicago Bears. But that's about it for like actual Detroit Lions to try and have some system continuity there. If you want to talk about a veteran quarterback, Teddy Bridgewater is a name that's been floated out there. He's also someone who retired last winter and then came back this year, but is, he's in his 30s now and coached high school football, and I don't know if he's going to want to come to Chicago to be a number 3 quarterback. He kind of came back for Detroit to go on a run, but the Bears aren't quite there. So I don't think a Bridgewater to the Bears thing is super, super likely to happen there. But some other veteran quarterbacks, if the Bears wanted to go that route, to have a number 3 QB who just has a little more experience than Tyson Bagent, but has also some connections to this Bears coaching staff. C.J. Beathard has been the Jacksonville Jaguars backup with Press Taylor in Jacksonville. There's a name to keep an eye on there. Jared Stidham has been the veteran backup with the Broncos with Declan Doyle for a couple of seasons now. Mac Jones was in Jacksonville with Press Taylor there. Jacoby Brissett, most recently with the Patriots. He worked with Eric Bieniemy on the Washington Commanders in 2023. Like, there's 4 or 5 different veteran quarterbacks that have connections to this Bears coaching staff if they want to do the veteran QB route. I don't expect that they will, but we don't know exactly how Ben Johnson and JT Barrett and company want to actually make this happen. One of the things that kind of blows my mind is that Jarrett Stidham of the Denver Broncos, who's been the Denver Broncos quarterback backup for the last couple seasons, is the same age as the Bears offensive coordinator who he coached with in Denver. Like, that's just a weird thing that's going to take some getting used to. But how about some like weapons, skill position players? 2 to keep an eye on here. Javonte Williams, the Broncos running back, and Kareem Hunt, the Chiefs running back. Javonte Williams comes from Denver, where Bears offensive coordinator Declan Doyle was the tight ends coach. Again, obviously not coaching the running backs specifically, but in all the offensive meetings, and obviously a bright offensive mind who pays attention to a lot of this stuff. Like, I don't know if Javonte Williams is the right range of like age and production of where the Bears are right now, because he's a guy who's, he's never been a 1,000-yard guy, and he's kind of had some ups and downs. So he comes in, if he came to Chicago, he's rotating in with Swift and Roschon, but he's not clearly an upgrade over those guys, but he might cost more than a regular number 3 running back because he's 25 years old. So we'll see if that lines up. Maybe somebody like Kareem Hunt coming over from the Chiefs, who obviously spent a lot of time in Kansas City with Eric Bieniemy when Bieniemy was first his running backs coach and then his offensive coordinator in Kansas City. Clearly, there's a lot of lingering Kareem Hunt baggage that I don't know if the Bears as an organization would like to be. I mean, I know the more time that passes, the more people forget and the more distance there is, but like Kareem Hunt was accused of doing some really bad stuff, and the Bears generally don't like to go after players with that type of baggage with them. But just a couple of running back names, if the Bears feel like they need to upgrade and add more at running back to get more juice in that room or whatever it is, Javonte Williams and Kareem Hunt both have those connections there. Wide receivers where it's more exciting for me, because you've got a bunch of those like past Chiefs receivers all hitting free agency this offseason. Juju Smith-Schuster was in Kansas City with Eric Bieniemy and then left and then came back this past season. But I mean, he's a guy who's been a 1,000-yard receiver before. He's not that anymore and wasn't really able to sustain that after just one great year in Pittsburgh. But like, still, if he's your number 3 wide receiver, I don't hate it. I think that'd be a fun player. You could still have Tyler Scott in there as your number 4, but someone who can play the slot role for you and do some different things on offense. I think someone like that would be fun. I'd probably aim a little bit higher and go for somebody like Demarcus Robinson from the Los Angeles Rams, who again was a Kansas City Chiefs draft pick and was there with Eric Bieniemy for I think 4 or 5 seasons, and he puts up a pretty steady 400 or 500 yards a year, and was technically a starter this past season for the Rams with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua dealing with all of their injuries and stuff in Los Angeles. You've got the connections there. And Mecole Hardman, their former first-round pick in Kansas City. He's really fallen off, and I don't know that he gets you as excited as you might have used to, but if you want to try and, reclamation project, try and rebuild Mecole Hardman, you've got 3 different former Chiefs wide receivers there, plus Kareem Hunt as another Chiefs weapon that you have the Eric Bieniemy connection to kind of know, like, how did this guy work at practice? How does he take care of his body? Is he really invested in all this, or is he, kind of just enjoying the celebrity lifestyle of being a football player? Like, there's different levels to it that you could have better information. But like, to me, it feels like Tim Patrick is most likely at wide receiver, and if not, I'd really love somebody like Demarcus Robinson that I think has some real veteran upside there. Doesn't have the same experience with Ben Johnson, but at least you know a little bit more of what you're getting there. One other name I'll throw out here. I was looking around at tight ends because the Bears are likely going to release Gerald Everett, and Mercedes Lewis is set to be a free agent, and I expect, well, at best he'd be your third tight end anyway. So there's not a lot of tight ends with a connection here, but New Orleans Saints tight end Juwan Johnson, I think was undrafted a few years ago for them. He's been kind of their number two, but they kind of rotate a lot of different tight ends in there with the whole Taysom Hill thing and what they've got. Trying to think of the guy's name, Foster Moreau. They brought in from the Raiders. It's kind of a weird tight end rotation, but the Bears hired the Saints offensive line coach Dan Rochar, and offensive line and tight end have a lot of crossover when it comes to coaching and meetings and stuff. And so I think there'd be a real connection there. He's actually coming off his best year where he had 550 receiving yards this past season, but he's never been take over the game and dominate type of tight end, but he could be a really, really solid number two with some familiarity for you here. I think that would be like, if you came away with Tim Patrick and Juwan Johnson this offseason, that's boring. But I think they're two really solid players with some of that familiarity that you can feel like, man, you're not having to spend a ton to get them, but you're getting a lot of bang for your buck, and they'll fit right in and help ease that transition a little bit to this new coaching staff and to this new Chicago Bears offense. That's kind of the main one connection there. The other, I mean, if we're kind of desperate for a tight end name to throw out there, there's a tight end from the Miami Dolphins whose name, Durham Smythe, was a draft pick of theirs, a 4th-round pick back in 2018. He was there for only a year or two when Ben Johnson was still on the Miami Dolphins coaching staff as an offensive assistant. It's a very weak connection there, but he's another guy who could be a really solid number 2 tight end for the Bears behind Cole Kmet. It's not going to take away snaps from Cole Kmet or anything, but it can be an option there to give you some more depth at that position. And finally, what you've all been waiting for, the return of the fullback to the Chicago Bears could be happening this offseason because the Lions rostered a fullback on and off. You look at the Saints teams that a lot of these coaching staffs have connections to, they rostered a fullback. The Broncos with Sean Payton and Declan Doyle rostered a fullback. And the Broncos fullback and the Saints fullback are both entering free agency this offseason. Could be a return for former Chicago Bears fullback Michael Burton is the Broncos fullback who's entering free agency. You could bring him with Declan Doyle in here to plug and play in this offense. Or the Saints fullback Adam Prentice is also a free agent. So don't be surprised if the Bears decide to bring in a fullback and get one of those two guys that their coaching staff has some real connections to. So a lot of different free agent targets we've been able to go through today. The Bears are not going to sign all of them. They may not sign any of them. I think they'll sign. I think it's a pretty good bet. The Bears will sign at least one of the free agents we talked about on the podcast today. And if they do, we're going to break down that free agent signing and every free agent signing for you all offseason long right here in the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming back tomorrow and make Locked On Bears your first listen once again so that you can finish each and every day with another opportunity to bear down.